Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to stay updated with our latest stories. It was one of those Tuesday afternoons, the kind that feel like the week has already been a month long, and the weekend is still a distant shore. The sky outside our kitchen window was the color of a bruised plum, threatening rain that never quite seemed to make up its mind to fall, much like Mark and I these days, hovering on the edge of something but never quite committing to a downpour or a clear sky. We'd been married for 27 years, Mark and I, 27 years of shared mornings, toothpaste caps left off, anniversaries remembered, and sometimes, like last year, almost forgotten. It's a long time to walk alongside someone, and mostly, it had been a good walk, a comfortable rhythm. But lately, the silence between us had grown, not the comfortable kind, but the kind that stretches thin and tight, like a wire about to snap. The argument, when it finally came, wasn't even about anything new. It was the same old tune, different verse. I'd asked him about the leaky faucet in the guest bathroom again, the one I'd mentioned maybe 5 times in the last 2 weeks. It wasn't just the drip, drip, drip that was getting to me. It was the feeling of being unheard, of my concerns being relegated to a mental to-do list that never got done. "I'll get to it, Sarah," he'd said, his eyes still glued to the sports channel, his voice edged with that familiar impatience that made me feel small. And just like that, the dam of my own frustrations broke. I wasn't just talking about the faucet anymore, was I? I was talking about the way he'd forgotten to pick up the dry cleaning for my sister's visit, the way he hadn't really asked about my day in what felt like weeks, the way we seemed to be orbiting each other rather than connecting. My voice got louder than I intended, sharper too. His rose to meet mine, a defensive wall going up instantly. "Can a man have a moment's peace in his own house?" He boomed, finally turning from the television, his face flushed. "You're always finding something, Sarah. Always." That stung. Always. Like my feelings were an inconvenience, a flaw in his otherwise smooth day. The words flew then, careless and sharp, each one a tiny paper cut, not deep enough to draw blood immediately, but stinging nonetheless. It ended, as these things often did, with me turning away, a cold knot in my stomach, and him retreating back into the blue flicker of the TV, the silence now thick with unspoken hurts. I remember standing at the kitchen sink, my hands gripping the cool porcelain, staring out at that indecisive sky. The house felt too small, the air too heavy. I wanted to scream, or maybe just cry, but I didn't either. I just felt hollowed out. That's when the doorbell chimed. My heart sank a little. We weren't expecting anyone. Mark grumbled something from the living room, probably annoyed at the interruption to his game. I smoothed down my apron, took a shaky breath, and went to answer. It was David. Mark's friend, David. He'd been Mark's fishing buddy, his confidant, his sounding board since college. David was a constant in our lives, a familiar presence at barbecues, birthdays, and the occasional impromptu weeknight dinner. He was a kind man, David, with gentle eyes and a quiet way about him. He was a widower, his beloved Mary gone nearly 5 years now, and there was a certain understanding that flowed from him, a sort of patient wisdom that I'd always appreciated, though usually from a slight distance. "Sarah," he said, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes, though it faltered a little as he must have seen the storm clouds still lingering on my face. He held a small cooler in one hand. "Mark mentioned you guys were grilling tonight? Thought I'd bring over some of that trout I caught up at Miller's Creek. Fresh as can be." My mind went blank for a second. Grilling? Mark hadn't said a word to me. The argument had probably pushed any such plans right out of his head, if they'd ever been there to begin with for him to tell me. The familiar pang of being overlooked, of being the last to know, pricked at me. "Oh, David, that's so thoughtful of you." I managed, trying to paste on a smile that felt as flimsy as tissue paper.
Come in, come in.
He stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the hallway with a different kind of energy, calmer, steadier than the agitated currents still swirling between me and Mark. I could hear Mark calling out from the living room, "Davy, my man, is that you?" His voice was suddenly jovial. All traces of our earlier conflict seemingly vanished for him, which was another little twist of the knife for me. How easily he could switch it off. David headed towards the living room, and I trailed behind, feeling like a ghost in my own home. The air was still thick to me, charged with the residue of our fight. I wondered if David could sense it. He was a perceptive man. I braced myself for the usual small talk, the careful navigating of domestic waters when a friend walks in on the aftermath of a marital spat. I just wanted to disappear, to not have to pretend that everything was perfectly fine when it so clearly wasn't. Little did I know, David wasn't going to follow the usual script. What he did next, well, it wasn't earth-shattering in a dramatic sense, but it was the beginning of something that would leave me utterly, and I mean utterly, speechless. Mark was already up, clapping David on the back, his earlier mood apparently forgotten, or at least expertly hidden. "Trout, you say? Fantastic. Sarah, we'll need the grill going." He said it casually, as if our earlier fiery exchange hadn't happened, as if my heart wasn't still aching in my chest. I just nodded, a tight, small nod, unable to meet his eyes, and turned towards the kitchen, intending to busy myself with something, anything, to avoid the forced pleasantries. I could feel David's gaze on me for a moment, a fleeting, unreadable expression. I expected him to dive into fishing stories with Mark, to let the awkwardness I was radiating just hang in the air, unaddressed. That's what usually happened. People don't like to get involved. They look away. But David, as I was about to find out, was not most people. He followed me, not Mark. He came into the kitchen. The rain finally started to fall then, a soft drumming against the window panes, as if the sky had finally decided to weep with me. I was rinsing some salad greens, more for something to do with my hands than anything else, my back mostly to the room. I heard him approach, his footsteps soft on the linoleum. I didn't turn around. I was bracing myself for some awkward comment, maybe a well-intentioned but ultimately unhelpful platitude about marriage. Instead, he just stood there for a moment, and the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was observant. "Sarah," he said, his voice gentle, not demanding, just present. I finally turned, my hands dripping water onto the floor. "Those are beautiful-looking tomatoes you've got there," he said, nodding towards the bowl of vibrant red tomatoes I'd picked from my little garden that morning, one of the few things that had brought me a sliver of joy that day. It was such a simple, innocuous comment. But it was the way he said it, the way he was looking at the tomatoes and then at me with a genuine kindness in his eyes, as if he truly saw them and perhaps saw a little bit of me too, the me that cared about her garden, the me that was currently feeling frayed at the edges. It was the first small pebble in what would become an avalanche of unexpected understanding. He didn't mention Mark. He didn't mention the fight I was sure he'd sensed. He just talked about tomatoes, and somehow, in that moment, it felt like he was speaking a language I desperately needed to hear. He didn't press. He just picked one up, admiring its color. "My Mary. She loved homegrown tomatoes more than anything," he said, his voice soft with memory. "Said they tasted like sunshine. She used to make this incredible tomato soup, nothing fancy, but it could cure anything, a bad day, a cold, anything." He wasn't looking at me directly then, but at the tomato in his hand, yet I felt his words were for me. He was sharing a piece of himself, a piece of his Mary, and in doing so, he was creating a little space, a little quiet clearing in the emotional wreckage of my afternoon. Mark called out again from the living room, something about finding the right music for the grilling, his voice oblivious and cheerful. David smiled faintly, a hint of sadness in it perhaps, for his Mary, or maybe for the complexities of all human hearts. "Why don't I give you a hand with these?" he offered, gesturing to the vegetables. "I make a pretty decent salad assistant, if I do say so myself." I was taken aback. It was such a small offer, but in the context of everything, the fight, my feeling of isolation, Mark's cheerful obliviousness, it felt enormous. Someone was choosing to step into my little circle of misery, not to fix it, but just to be there, to help with the salad, to share the quiet rhythm of kitchen work. It was the last thing I expected. And it was just the beginning. We worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the chop of the knife, the gentle rain outside, and the distant murmur of Mark's music. It was strange, standing side by side with my husband's friend, a man I knew, yet didn't really know, not like this. There was a calmness about him that was slowly seeping into me, or maybe I was just so starved for a moment of peace that I soaked it up like a dry sponge. He started to hum a little tune, something old-fashioned and sweet. It wasn't a performance, just a soft, absent-minded sound, the kind people make when they're content in their task. I found myself relaxing, my shoulders a-nodding just a fraction. He didn't try to draw me into a conversation about what was wrong. He didn't offer advice. He just chopped cucumbers with a steady, rhythmic motion and hummed. And that, in itself, was a profound kindness. He saw I was hurting, and instead of prying or retreating, he simply chose to be a quiet, steady presence. He was offering companionship without demand, a shared moment of normalcy in the midst of my emotional turmoil. It was disarming. It was unexpected. And the really speechless part, the part that still makes my breath catch when I think about it, that was still to come, quietly. The aroma of the trout, now sizzling on the grill Mark had finally gotten going, started to drift in, mingling with the scent of damp earth from the rain. Mark seemed in high spirits, calling out cheerful comments to David, who would respond with equal good humor, yet somehow, it didn't break the fragile peace he had established with me in the kitchen. It was as if David could exist in two spaces at once, Mark's boisterous, oblivious world, and my quieter, more reflective one. After a while, as we finished preparing the salad, he leaned against the counter, drying his hands on a towel. "Sarah," he began, his voice still gentle, "Mark is a good man. You know that. He just, well, like a lot of us men, he sometimes gets lost in his own world, forgets to look up and see the weather on other people's faces." It wasn't an excuse for Mark, not really. It was more like a simple statement of fact, delivered without judgment. And then he said the thing that really opened the door. Mary used to say, I was like a stubborn mule sometimes, needing a good nudge to see what was right in front of me. He chuckled softly, a self-deprecating sound. She was usually right. He paused, then met my eyes directly, his gaze clear and kind. It's not easy, feeling like you're not being heard or seen. There it was.
He saw.
He actually saw. Not just the surface anger of the argument, but the deeper ache beneath it. And he wasn't afraid to name it, gently, respectfully. That was the moment the ground began to shift beneath my feet. He then moved towards the small kitchen table, the one where I often sat alone with my morning coffee, and pulled out a chair. Not for himself, but for me. "Why don't you sit for a minute?" he suggested, his tone soft but with a quiet authority that was surprisingly compelling. "The salad's done. Mark's got the fish handled. Just for a minute." I hesitated. Sitting felt too vulnerable, too much like admitting how much I needed to. But his expression was open, inviting, with no pressure, just a simple offer of respite. So I sat. He didn't sit opposite me immediately, like an inquisitor or a counselor. Instead, he poured 2 glasses of water, placing one in front of me. Then he sat, not directly across, but slightly angled, less confrontational, more companionable. The rain had eased to a gentle patter. "Mary also used to say," he continued, as if we were in the middle of a long, comfortable conversation, "that sometimes the best way to find a lost thing is to stop looking for it so hard. To just get quiet and let it come to you." He wasn't talking about lost keys or spectacles, I knew that. He was talking about connection, about understanding, maybe even about happiness. He was sharing these little pearls of wisdom from his life with Mary, not as advice, but as shared human experience. It was incredibly intimate, yet not invasive. He was simply opening a door, inviting me to step through if I chose, into a space where I could perhaps find a different perspective, a little bit of that quiet he was talking about. I took a sip of water, the coolness a balm to my dry throat. I still hadn't said much, but I was listening with every fiber of my being. What was happening here? My husband's friend, in the quiet of my kitchen, after a stupid, painful argument, was offering me solace. And a strange sort of clarity was beginning to dawn. He didn't ask me about the argument. Not directly. He didn't need to. It was like he understood the shape of it, the contours of the hurt, without needing the specific details. "You know," he said, looking out the window at the now glistening leaves in the garden, "Mark talks about you all the time when we're out fishing. Worries about you. Brags about you too, in his own way." He smiled faintly. "He told me last week how proud he was of the way you handled that whole situation with your sister's move, how you stepped in and sorted everything out. Said you were his rock." I stared at him. Mark had said that? To David? He'd never said anything like that to me. Not in years, it felt like. A complicated emotion welled up in me. Surprise, a flicker of warmth, but also a renewed pang of sadness that he could say these things to his friend, but not to me. David, as if sensing my unspoken thought, continued softly, "Sometimes men are fools, Sarah. We think things, we feel things, deep down, but the words get stuck somewhere between our hearts and our mouths. Especially with the people who matter most." He paused, then added, "It's not right, but it happens. Doesn't mean the feelings aren't there." His gaze was steady, full of a quiet empathy that wrapped around me like a comforting shawl. He wasn't making excuses for Mark, not really. He was offering a glimpse into a perspective I rarely considered, the internal world of my husband, a world I felt increasingly locked out of. He wasn't taking sides. He was building a bridge, or at least showing me where the foundations of one might lie. And then, he did the most unexpected thing of all, something that went beyond kind words and gentle observations. He reached across the small space between us, not to touch my hand, but to pick up a fallen leaf from my sleeve, a tiny speck of green the first hadn't even noticed. A simple gesture, yet it felt incredibly personal, incredibly seen. He held the tiny leaf for a moment, looking at it with a thoughtful expression. "Life's a bit like your garden, isn't it, Sarah?" he mused, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes the weeds try to take over, and things get overgrown. Sometimes a harsh word is like a sudden frost, nipping the new buds." He looked up at me then, his eyes holding a profound understanding. But the roots are still there, aren't they?
Deep down.
The good stuff. The things that made you plant the garden in the first place. He wasn't just talking about my petunias and tomato plants. He was talking about my marriage, about the 27 years Mark and I had shared. He was reminding me, so gently, that beneath the current layer of neglect and misunderstanding, something vital might still exist. He wasn't telling me what to do or how to feel. He was just holding up a mirror, a very clean and compassionate mirror, and allowing me to see a reflection that wasn't entirely bleak. He made no demands on me, asked for no outpouring of my troubles. He simply created a space for me to breathe, to just be, in the midst of my emotional storm. And in that space, something began to shift within me. A tiny seed of hope, perhaps, or maybe just the first dawning of a different way to look at the long, tangled path of a shared life. The speechless part wasn't a single moment, it was a culmination, a growing awareness of the extraordinary gift of his quiet, unassuming presence, his willingness to truly see and acknowledge another person's pain without trying to fix it or diminish it. It was the profound realization that sometimes the deepest connections come from the most unexpected quarters, in the most unassuming ways. And all this from my husband's fishing buddy on a rainy Tuesday afternoon after a stupid fight about a leaky faucet. The world, I was beginning to see, still held an infinite